the ways in which it corrupts in terms of the symptoms, to use David Owen's phrase, that are exhibited, I mean, are fairly straightforward. So you get issues like an inflation of the self. So a person becomes more and more empowered and able to act in kind of slightly reckless ways, and they become they have an inflated notion of their own capacity. That's one of the main things that you see, sort of in the eyes of a person who power has gone to the head, you know. But you also get that progressive isolation where you only speak, people are only speaking to one another, they're only surrounded by advisors who agree with them. So in that sense, that's another kind of classic symptom that you see. I think also that the issue of a complete lack of awareness of what's happening. So that's a particular kind of psychological problem whereby what's happening to you is totally outside your awareness. You have no insight into it whatsoever. And therefore, if you appeal to somebody and say, look, why are you behaving in this new and strange way? They won't know what you're talking about. And I think probably the one that most people notice is the growing contempt for everybody who doesn't have that status. So you get just a hatred or a fear and an irritation with everybody who's not doing what they're told, you know. So that's when you say how does it corrupt, it partly corrupts in those ways. But I think you're also asking what actually is going on psychologically that a person is changing their behaviour and indeed their personality. Because their status in an organisation is becoming elevated. And that's a trickier idea. I mean, we don't know enough about the human mind, nor do we know enough about what humans are like in organisations to really be able to say, look, you know what's happening? It's this. But in the book I try one. I try to say, look, if we talk about changes in our understanding of the brain, sort of developments in neurobiology and cognitive science, you can see that what's actually happening is that a person is, as they become elevated in an organisation, so they lose contact with things that everybody else can see. So I try to argue that corruption by power is a disorder of perception. It prevents you from being able to see certain things that you could see before. So distorted perception, that's a very interesting psychological event. I mean, why is it that as you increase your power in an organisation, you don't notice certain things, you become distorted in your understanding of your own abilities and these kinds of things? And you can see that the human mind is probably structured in certain ways to simplify what is a very complex sensory environment. So we're very good at selecting what's important and screening out things that aren't important. A classic example of this would be stereotyping, where we make a judgment about an entire group of people based on very poor quality information. But there are many examples as we move through the world where that benefits us greatly. So we can move very quickly to solve problems if we make these simplifications, if we screen out information. And what seems to be happening when somebody is corrupted by power is that those innate, clever structures of the human mind are somehow working with the elevated status in order to generate this very strange psychological state. I mean, David Owen, again, very interesting, calls it a disorder of position. So it's a psychological problem that's related to your membership of a group. So, which is very interesting because it's not just psychological, it's also social. And I think that when you see this is why you begin to understand why corruption by power doesn't only affect those who hold power. Because, in fact, we're all in these hierarchic positions. And just as the person who is corrupted by holding a high status position is suffering from a disorder of perception, you could also say that those people who are subordinates in a hierarchy are also suffering from a kind of mirror image of a disorder of perception in which they are helpless, they have no expertise, you can't do anything about the horrors of politics, it's just those guys making the same mistakes they've always made, what do you expect? So when you ask somebody, does power corrupt, they all sort of go, yeah, yes it does, and here's 10 stories about that they've experienced in terms of corruption by power. But there's this other slightly more troubling issue whereby we are all partly, in some ways, tempted to make these kinds of mistakes, either as power holders, you know, from a child in a bullying child in a playground, all the way up through a ridiculous boss in your office, but at the same time to be corrupted as a subordinate into those dependency and relationships, that learned helplessness, you know, it's a good phrase, where we think nothing can be done. And I think that's one of the reasons that the solution to this problem, because we do need a solution, because the costs are really high of corruption by power, and the separation of democratic politics into a group of people who can act and can't be stopped, and a group of people, the citizens, who just feel completely overwhelmed and don't know how to put their input and knowledge into the system. The solution is democracy, but it's not the kind of democracy we have now. It's a much more aggressive populist democracy, where the populace is having lots of chances to learn to be good democratic citizens. So aggressive, vigilant democratic citizens who watch their leaders and are deeply suspicious of their tendency to slip into corruption by power, and indeed their own temptation to just go, I'm going to the pub, let them decide. We will do that as long as we can. But luckily, I think, or tragically, elites always mess up. And when they do, the citizenry realises you've got to actually do something. You can't just let elites run away and make your decisions for you, because they're just so notoriously bad at it, because they become corrupted by power. So I think that, you know, one of the things that is very interesting about this is the idea that a deeper, more active and engaged democratic citizenry is, first of all, treats the leaders' problem, but also solves their own problem. And I think that you can see that some of the increasing interest in empowering the populace and educating the populace so we don't just run around, you know, breaking things, is the solution to this problem.